car so technically advanced, so breathtakingly luxurious, that 70 years later engineers still look back at it with genuine respect. Now imagine that same car being the last gasp of a dying giant. That's the story of the 1955 Packard Caribbean. This wasn't just an automobile. This was a declaration from a proud American company that refused to go quietly. A car built with more engineering ambition than almost anything Detroit had ever produced, arriving at exactly the wrong moment in history, from a company teetering on the edge of an abyss it couldn't quite see clearly enough to avoid. The 1955 Packard Caribbean is one of the most beautiful, most technically sophisticated, and most heartbreaking cars ever to roll out of Detroit. And today we're going to tell its full story, the engineering triumphs, the business disasters, the bold decisions, and the crushing mistakes that made 1955 the most fascinating and most tragic year in Packard's long history. By the end of this video, you will never look at a 1955 Packard the same way again. Before 1955, you need to understand what Packard meant in America. For decades, the Packard name carried a weight that very few brands in any industry have ever achieved. If you had truly made it in America, you drove a Packard. Presidents rode in them. Military commanders were chauffeured in them. Movie stars, industrialists, titans of business, they all chose Packard. The famous slogan said it all: ask the man who owns one. It worked because it was true. Packard owners were evangelical. The quality, the refinement, the sense of occasion, it was unlike anything else on American roads. During World War II, Packard built Merlin V-12 aircraft engines under license from Rolls-Royce, the very engines that powered the P-51 Mustang. Packard's engineering reputation was beyond reproach. But then the post-war world arrived, and everything changed. Packard made a fateful decision to offer lower-priced models to reach a broader market. More customers, more revenue. The logic made sense. But when regular buyers started showing up in Packards, the wealthy buyers who had defined the brand started drifting toward Cadillac. The exclusivity evaporated. The magic was diluted. And no amount of marketing could fully restore what had been lost. By the early 1950s, Packard was in serious trouble. The cold, hard numbers tell a brutal story. In 1951, Packard sold more than 100,000 cars. That's a real business with momentum, with dealers, with a future. By 1954, just 3 years later, that number had collapsed to barely 31,000. In 3 years, Packard lost nearly 70% of its sales volume. That's not a slump. That's a freefall. The dealer network was collapsing alongside sales. At its peak, Packard had nearly 4,000 dealer locations. By 1954, that number had fallen to just 1,200, and in 1953 alone, 500 dealerships had closed their doors or switched to other brands. 500 locations in a single year. When the people who have their own money invested in selling your product start walking away in droves, the situation is dire. This was the environment Packard's president James J. Nance was navigating as he looked toward 1955. And the decisions he made, some brilliant, some catastrophic, would define not just a model year, but the entire fate of one of America's greatest automotive names. James Nance was not a man who did things halfway. He understood that Packard couldn't survive fighting GM, Ford, and Chrysler in the middle of the market. Packard's only path was going back up, reclaiming the luxury crown, rebuilding the mystique, reminding wealthy buyers why Packard had once been the only name that mattered. To do that, he needed financial backing. One option on the table was joining Nash and Hudson in American Motors Corporation. Just think about that. Nash, Hudson, and Packard forming a combined force against the Big Three. History could have gone a very different direction. But Nance walked away from that deal. Instead, in October 1954, he approved a merger with Studebaker, forming the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it would prove to be a slow-motion disaster. Here's the cruel irony. Although Packard had essentially purchased Studebaker through a stock transaction, Studebaker was actually the larger company and in even worse financial shape than Packard. Rather than two struggling companies forming one strong one, what happened was more like two drowning men grabbing each other on the way down. But in January 1955, none of that was visible from the outside. Packard was charging forward with the most ambitious lineup and most impressive engineering advances it had offered in years. Let's talk about what made the 1955 Packard technically remarkable, because this is where the story gets genuinely exciting. The single most impressive achievement, and arguably one of the most impressive achievements in all of American automotive engineering at that moment, was what Packard called the Torsion-Level Ride suspension system. And when I tell you what the system did, I want you to remember the year, 1955. The Torsion-Level Ride used 4 torsion bars connected to all 4 wheels. But here's what made it revolutionary. The system incorporated electric motors that continuously monitored and adjusted the suspension to keep the car perfectly level, regardless of load, regardless of road conditions, regardless of how passengers were distributed in the car. A self-leveling suspension system. In 1955, with electric motors doing the work automatically. If the trunk was heavily loaded, the car leveled itself. If several passengers sat on one side, the car corrected for it. The result was what period road testers called a magic carpet ride. Not marketing language, but the honest reaction of automotive journalists who climbed out of these cars slightly stunned. Contemporary observers called it the most sophisticated suspension system in the Motor City. In 1955, Cadillac and Lincoln were both investing heavily in engineering. And yet Packard, smaller, poorer, more constrained, managed to produce something its larger rivals couldn't match. The system also connected all 4 corners of the car through those torsion bars, giving the chassis a sense of cohesion that competitors simply couldn't replicate. The 1955 Packard handled in a way that stood apart from everything else on the market. The suspension was remarkable, but Packard also introduced a brand new overhead valve V8 that year, and it was a genuinely impressive piece of machinery. The 1950s were the golden age of the American V8. Chevrolet had just introduced its legendary small block. Chrysler had the legendary Hemi. Ford had its Y-block. The horsepower race was in full swing, and any luxury manufacturer that wanted to be taken seriously needed an engine that could hold its head up in that company. Packard delivered. The new V8 displaced between 320 and 352 cubic inches depending on the model, and in its most powerful tune, reserved for the Caribbean, it produced 275 horsepower. Smooth, torquey, and refined in a way that spoke to Packard's long engineering tradition. Contemporary road tests praised it enthusiastically. It was competitive with anything Cadillac or Lincoln was offering. Paired with this engine was a thoroughly re-engineered automatic transmission, the Twin Ultramatic. Packard had offered the Ultramatic for years, but the 1955 version was a significant improvement in smoothness, response, and overall refinement. The Twin Ultramatic provided the seamless, imperceptible gear changes that luxury buyers expected, matching the V8's character perfectly. And following the lead of Nash and Pontiac the previous year, Packard also introduced a modern, fully integrated air conditioning system. For a car at this price level, attending to every aspect of the driving experience wasn't optional, it was mandatory. So, revolutionary self-leveling suspension, a powerful new V8, a refined automatic transmission, and integrated air conditioning. That's a compelling package by any measure, in any era. Now, let's talk about how these cars looked, because beauty matters enormously in the luxury car business. The 1955 Packards featured modern, long, low proportions that were the design language of American luxury in the mid-1950s. The styling was developed with genuine flair, featuring one of the most distinctive design elements of the year, the cathedral taillights. These weren't just functional taillights, they were jewelry, a unique rear-end signature that set the Packard apart from anything Cadillac or Lincoln was offering and announced your arrival from behind. The fronts were clean and purposeful. The overall proportions were excellent. These were cars that looked exactly as expensive and exclusive as they were. One honest note, the 1955 styling, as fresh as it was still built on John Reinhardt's 1951 body shell. With limited resources, developing an entirely new body structure simply wasn't in the budget. So while the cars looked modern and attractive, they were evolution rather than revolution when it came to the underlying structure. for an industry racing ahead at tremendous speed. With GM refreshing its lineup almost annually, this was a competitive disadvantage. But given the massive engineering investments in suspension, engine, and transmission, something had to carry over. It was the body shell that paid the price. Production commenced on January 17, 1955, and the lineup covered a wider range than many people realize. At the entry level were the Clipper models on a 122-inch wheelbase, priced between $2,500 and $3,000, squarely in Buick territory. The Clipper came in base and custom trim, offering sedans and two-door hardtops. The base hardtop was called the Panama, the custom version was the Constellation. These Clippers accounted for roughly two-thirds of Packard's total 1955 production. They were solid, well-equipped cars offering genuine value. But they weren't what the Packard faithful were buying, and 1 year later they'd be spun off as a separate brand entirely. The real story was the senior Packards on the longer 127-inch wheelbase. 3 models, 3 very different personalities. The Patrician was the flagship four-door sedan, dignified, formal, proper. With over 9,000 units produced, it was the most popular senior Packard by a wide margin. Business executives and successful professionals who wanted the full Packard experience in a practical format chose the Patrician. The 400 was the two-door hardtop, and the name was a deliberate cultural reference to the 400, the phrase used to describe New York's most prominent social families. Calling your luxury hardtop the 400 was a signal. This car is for people who have arrived. It offered much of the Caribbean's visual drama at a somewhat lower price point. And then at the absolute top there was the Caribbean. The 1955 Packard Caribbean. Even the name sounds like wealth. Like a sun-soaked, money-is-no-object lifestyle. The Caribbean was Packard's only convertible for 1955, the car that appeared in every advertisement, the car that represented everything Packard aspired to be at its most glamorous. At $5,932, it was extraordinarily expensive. A full $2,000 more than either the Patrician or 400. To put that number in context, a well-equipped family car in 1955 cost $2,000 to $2,500. The Caribbean cost more than twice that. This was a purchase for people to whom $5,932 for an automobile felt entirely appropriate. What did you get for that money? Everything best about the 1955 Packard, concentrated and amplified. You got the Torsion-Level Ride in full magic carpet glory. You got the most powerful version of the new V8, the full 275 horsepower. You got the Twin Ultramatic at its most refined. You got the integrated air conditioning. But most dramatically, you got the styling. Because the Caribbean received special treatment that set it apart from every other car in the lineup. That dual scoop hood gave the car an aggressive, purposeful character that stood in contrast to the more formal Patrician. Combined with the open-air convertible body, those scoops made the Caribbean look like it meant serious business. And then there was the paint, a tritone paint scheme, 3 carefully coordinated colors that made the car look like a rolling piece of automotive jewelry. When you've spent nearly $6,000 on an automobile, you don't want to blend in. The Caribbean ensured you never would. Production of the 1955 Caribbean was limited to approximately 500 units. Just 500 cars in the entire country. In an era when Chevrolet was selling hundreds of thousands, that production number is almost impossibly small. But that rarity was part of the appeal. This wasn't a car you saw every day. This was a car you glimpsed occasionally and never forgot. Now we have to talk about the part of the 1955 story that breaks your heart. Because for all the engineering brilliance and genuine ambition, there was a manufacturing situation unfolding in Detroit that threatened to undermine everything. It started with Briggs Manufacturing, Packard's longtime body supplier. Briggs had built Packard steel bodies for years. Then Chrysler bought Briggs. Suddenly, Packard's body supplier was owned by a direct competitor. Packard was forced to lease the Briggs Connor Avenue plant and continue production there. Manageable in theory. But then came the decision that would haunt the company. Rather than maintaining final assembly at Packard's historic East Grand Boulevard facility, properly equipped with established quality systems and experienced workers, someone approved moving final assembly to Connor Avenue. Connor Avenue was a body plant, not a final assembly facility. The workflow was wrong. The equipment was wrong. The processes were wrong. Production capacity suffered. Quality control suffered. Problems that should have been caught during assembly were instead being discovered by customers, the absolute worst outcome in the luxury car business, where buyers are paying premium prices specifically because they expect perfection. It got bad enough that Packard had to set up a separate repair facility a mile down the street from Connor Avenue dedicated entirely to fixing quality problems before cars could be delivered to dealers. Let that sink in. A separate fix-it line, a mile away, just to bring cars up to standard. In a luxury car company, that is an expensive, demoralizing, and ultimately unsustainable way to build automobiles. Even specific engineering details suffered. Period reports noted that the master cylinder for the power brake standard equipment on these cars was poorly located, creating servicing problems. For a near $6,000 automobile, details like that damage the ownership experience significantly. Despite the Connor Avenue chaos, 1955 actually produced some encouraging numbers. Total Packard production reached approximately 55,000 cars, nearly doubled the brutal 31,000 of 1954. That looked like a genuine recovery. But those 55,000 cars were produced on only an 8-month production schedule, since Packard's model year started in January rather than the industry standard fall. Annualized, the numbers were less impressive than they appeared. More critically, look at the distribution. The Clippers, the entry-level, Buick-priced models, accounted for 2/3 of all production. For every senior Packard sold, 2 Clippers sold. And while Clippers were good cars, they weren't rebuilding the luxury image Packard desperately needed. The Patrician's 9,000 units dwarfed the 400 and Caribbean combined. And the Caribbean, 500 units at $5,932 each, was barely a rounding error in terms of revenue for a company under this kind of financial pressure. The decision to spin the Clipper off as a separate brand for 1956 was made, almost certainly because it was outselling senior Packards by such a wide margin. The logic was sound. Separate the brands, let Packard reclaim its exclusive identity. In theory, everyone wins. But execution required resources that were becoming dangerously scarce. The Studebaker merger, rather than providing financial strength, was proving to be a drain. Studebaker's problems were worse than had been fully understood at the time of the deal, and the combined company was hemorrhaging money. The manufacturing crisis at Connor Avenue wasn't improving. Quality issues were persisting. The separate repair facility down the street was an ongoing cost that a healthy company could absorb, but a struggling one simply couldn't sustain. And the competitive pressure from GM, Ford, and Chrysler wasn't going to relent. These were companies that could outspend Packard 50 times over on engineering, styling, advertising, dealer support. Every year they introduced new models and new features. Packard was trying to keep pace with a fraction of the resources. 1956 would be the final year for genuine Detroit-built Packards. And 1957? There was technically a car called a Packard. But it was a rebadged Studebaker President, a facelift Studebaker with Packard badges applied. The Packard Clipper, they called it. If you knew anything about automobiles, the pretense was transparent. The mark that had carried presidents, that had built Merlin engines for the P-51 Mustang, that had pioneered engineering advance after engineering advance, that had produced the extraordinary 1955 Caribbean with its self-leveling suspension and tritone paint and nearly $6,000 price tag, was gone. What remained was a badge on someone else's car, built by a company that was itself struggling for survival. So why are we here, 70 years later, talking about a car produced in numbers that wouldn't register as a footnote in modern production figures? Because the 1955 Packard Caribbean represents something important and enduring. It represents the last moment when Packard was fully, authentically, completely itself. When the engineers and designers and craftspeople who made up that company were creating something that reflected their full capability. It wasn't compromised by badge engineering. It wasn't a rebodied something else. It was a Packard, from the torsion bars to the cathedral taillights to the tritone paint. The Torsion-Level Ride was genuinely ahead of its time. Self-leveling suspension systems using similar principles would eventually become standard on high-end European luxury cars, and engineers studying suspension history consistently point to Packard's 1955 work as pioneering. The 275 horsepower V8 was genuinely competitive. The styling was genuinely beautiful. Today, original, well-preserved 1955 Caribbeans command serious money at auction, and rightfully so. They are beautiful objects, technically fascinating, historically significant, and rare enough that encountering one is genuinely special. When you see one in the flesh, that dual-scoop hood, those cathedral taillights, that tritone paint catching the light, there's an emotional quality to the experience that goes beyond just looking at an old car. You're looking at the peak of American luxury ambition from a company that knew, somewhere in its institutional soul, that time was running short. And instead of cutting corners, instead of phoning it in, instead of coasting on reputation, Packard poured everything it had left into one extraordinary final statement. That defiance, that refusal to go quietly, that we will not surrender our standards attitude speaks to something deeply human. And it speaks to us still, 7 decades later, in the gleam of a Caribbean's chrome and the whisper of that remarkable suspension floating over the road beneath its wheels. The 1955 Packard Caribbean was not a perfect car. It was heavy. It came from a factory fighting quality demons. It was born into a company in serious financial trouble. But within all those constraints, the people who made it produced something genuinely extraordinary. When you see one today at a concours, at a classic car show, in a museum, stop. Take a moment. Look at it properly. Think about the engineers who designed that torsion-level system. Think about the 500 people who wrote checks for $5,932 and drove away in what was genuinely one of the finest automobiles in the world at that moment. The 1955 Packard Caribbean. America's last great luxury gamble. Brilliant, beautiful, and absolutely worth remembering. If you made it all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one are exactly why we're here. The 1955 Caribbean isn't just a car. It's a piece of American history that deserves to be told properly. If you've ever seen one in person, tell me about it in the comments, because I guarantee you didn't forget it. Subscribe for more deep dives like this one. We'll see you next time.